Cryptocurrencies finally find some friends, with Bitcoin up 50% from its lows. Signs of political cooperation on the voice referendum, and the $65 billion barney between an Indian giant and a New York hedge fund. It's Tuesday, the 31st of January, 2023. Welcome to Fear and Greed, Australia's most popular business podcast. I'm Michael Thompson, and good morning, Sean Aylmer.
Good morning, Michael.
Now, Sean, after the show, you've got a chat coming up with Charlie Hales, the Asia Pacific Managing Director at Waterstones, which is a UK-based tech company.
Yes, we got into what's going on in cyberland, and particularly post-Optus, post-Medibank, what companies need to do to be prepared for the almost inevitable cyber attack that's coming their way. Anyone running a business, be it a small business or a large business, should listen to this interview.
Yeah, it is a really important one to listen to. It's coming up a little bit later on. The main story this morning, though, Sean, finally, after some, I suppose you'd say, pretty dire days, really, cryptocurrencies and other non-US dollar currencies, like the Aussie dollar, are shining again.
Yes, it's always risky talking about currencies and cryptos because things change so quickly in those markets. I remember Alan Greenspan, the former boss of the Fed, when someone asked, how do you predict currencies? He said, toss a coin, you've got as much chance getting it right. So, keeping that in mind, there is definitely a greater appetite for risk among global investors at the moment, and that's really helped cryptos like Bitcoin, Ether, Tether, BNB, otherwise known as Binance Coin, and Cardano, as well as the rest. Bitcoin is the largest of the crypto units, and its value is up 50% since it bottomed in November last year, and 30% since the collapse of the FTX crypto exchange. Now, Michael, the glory days ain't back. 15 months ago, one Bitcoin was worth north of 65,000 US dollars. In fact, it nearly hit 70,000 US dollars. Today, it's closer to 24,000 US dollars, but sentiment has certainly improved on cryptos.
So Sean, basically, if you're listening to this at, say, 6:30 a.m., then it's probably accurate at the moment, but listen at 8:30 or 9:30 or 10:30, and things could have changed dramatically by then. Why has sentiment improved so much?
Well, let's have a little lesson here. I like these lessons, Michael.
Oh,
Investors get cold. I heard that.
Sorry.
Investors get cold feet around risky assets when things look bad. Now, the Aussie dollar isn't that risky an asset, but we saw how far it fell against the US dollar last year when interest rates were rising and there were fears of a global recession. Cryptocurrencies, kind of think of it like the Aussie dollar, just a lot more risky. So they were sold off big time. But as the risk of a severe global recession recedes, in fact, people don't think Europe will go into recession at all, and in the US, they think it'll be mild, riskier assets, such as digital units, are finding new advocates. Now, according to crypto newsletters, which certainly have a sense of self-interest in some of those newsletters, institutions are back supporting cryptos. I don't know whether that's true or not, but certainly values have risen. Someone is supporting cryptos.
And the Aussie dollar has done well.
Yeah, it has. I mean, against the US dollar, for all those risk reasons that we were talking about, it's done much better. Also, the expectation that the Reserve Bank will lift interest rates in a week's time or so means that that's pushed the dollar higher. In the very short term, interest rates matter for currencies, not so much in the long term. The Aussie's trading around 71 US cents. That's close to 7-month highs. Since late last year, it's also up against the yen, which is important because Japan is a major trading partner, the British pound, the New Zealand dollar, and the euro. Might be a good time to think about going overseas, Michael. I say as an aside. Whatever it is, riskier assets, as demonstrated by cryptos and less so by the Aussie, are a little bit back in favour.
I followed every single word of that lesson. Thank you, Sean.
Oh, you're welcome.
Now, how did the local equity market perform yesterday?
Well, the S&P ASX 200 closed down just a touch to 7,482 points. Given the strong lead-in from Wall Street over the weekend, that was perhaps a little disappointing. The banks were mixed while the retailers fell. Woolworths dropped more than 1% to $34.77 a share. Property group Goodman was up more than 1%, while Telstra also did well. The standout among the very large caps was software group WiseTech Global. That did follow a rebound in tech stocks on Wall Street over the weekend. WiseTech Global's share price jumped 5% to $60.59. Core Lithium was the best of the large caps, up nearly 9% after releasing its quarterly activities report. Iron ore producer Champion Iron was the worst, falling 7%. In corporate news, Michael, Bega Cheese will buy Vitasoy Australia. It's pushing to expand its footprint in plant-based beverages and products. And Metcash said its CEO, Scott Marshall, after 30 years at the company, has resigned to pursue another career opportunity.
All right. What's happening on international markets?
Well, it's not great news at the petrol bowser, with oil prices rising, a drone attack in Iran, and promises by Beijing to boost consumption in the world's second largest economy combined to push Brent prices higher. There was good news for the big miners, with iron ore prices hitting their highest level in 7 months yesterday at just over $128 a tonne. That followed the resumption of trading in China following the Lunar New Year celebrations last week. Now, that should be good news, but it didn't seem to help the local iron ore plays, with Fortescue and Rio Tinto both down more than 1% and BHP off 0.6%. Also worth mentioning this morning, Michael, is trading in Chinese equities. Reopened after that lunar long break, the CSI 300 was up by as much as 2.1%. Now, that means the market at one point yesterday was 20% higher than late October, which is the technical definition of a bull market.
Well, there you go. And I just love the name, the CSI 300. It sounds like it should be a crime show.
I think it is a crime show, isn't it?
Yeah.
CSI.
There are that many CSI. You got CSI Miami, CSI New York, the original CSI in Vegas. Now you got CSI 300.
A welcome addition, Michael, a welcome addition.
Yes, indeed. All right, we'll be back in a moment with the rest of the day's business news. Sean, opposition leader Peter Dutton will attend a meeting of the Albanese government's voice referendum working group this week after writing to the Prime Minister with a series of questions about how the Indigenous voice would operate.
Yes, that's right. Now, his decision to attend follows a formal request from Aboriginal leaders from across the nation for Mr Albanese and Mr Dutton to work together. According to The Australian, in a letter to both leaders this month, the Empowered Communities Alliance of Leaders from every state and the Northern Territory asked Mr Albanese and Mr Dutton to find a political consensus on what an Indigenous voice to Parliament could look like. They warned the referendum process was at a crossroads and risked dividing Australians. Now, Green Senator Sarah Hanson-Young probably said it for many Australians when she yesterday positioned Dutton's decision as a positive step forward. Mind you, her own party room is a bit of a mess on the issue, with the party's First Nations spokesperson, Lydia Thorpe, who is Indigenous, saying she'll vote no in the referendum.
And just staying in politics, Sean, the government yesterday announced a new national cultural policy, including a $300 million spend and the establishment of Creative Australia.
Yes, the Prime Minister said it was all about our soul and identity. I like that, Michael. Soul and identity.
It's good language, isn't it? Strong. Very
strong.
Emotive.
He said the establishment of Creative Australia would be a reimagined and properly funded Australia Council. It will include a bunch of new functions. There'll be Music Australia, which will be established to support the Australian music industry. I can already hear our colleague Adam Lang clapping. Writers Australia will provide direct support to the literature sector from 2025. Yes, Michael, I'm sure you're clapping that one, being an almost published author. And the government will establish a poet laureate for Australia. So there's three of us in this. Who could that go to?
Sure.
Anyway.
I would love to hear your poetry, please. We may do that on a separate podcast just so that we don't adversely affect the audience.
Yeah. Anyway, under the scheme, there'll also be quotas for Australian content on streaming services from July 1 next year.
Yeah, and you are right, Sean, and I'll acknowledge my kind of vested interest in this, is some of those changes for writers are really quite significant. And one of them is basically just moving it into the 21st century, whereby, did you know that at the moment, if you borrow a book from a library, a physical book from a library, then there are systems set up that the author who wrote that book receives a payment, and which is kind of the way it should be, and books should be freely available for people through libraries. But if you borrow an ebook or an audiobook or any of those kinds of things through a library, the author, the publisher gets nothing. And so this is part of this policy, just basically corrects that and as I said, pulls it forward into the 21st century. So I am biased, obviously, with my book coming out on the 1st of March, but I think it's a great move.
Well said. Check out.
Oh, so look, I declared my self-interest, and look, no, you know what? I'm not going to get worked up over this. We're just going to move straight on. Sean, some of the country's biggest insurers, including IAG and Suncorp, have experienced a spike in claims from the floods in New Zealand.
Yes, the crisis in that country continues to unfold, with at least 4 people dead and thousands of homes flooded in Auckland, which is home to about 1.6 million residents. Auckland, which is home to about 1.6 million residents, has been declared in a state of emergency. More severe rainfall is expected today. Now, the mayor of that city, Wayne Brown, yesterday conceded incorrect decisions may have been made by emergency management in response to the crisis. Meanwhile, Suncorp has received about 3,000 claims and expects the number to increase as flooding continues. And IAG said it's received about 5,000 claims across its Kiwi brands. It too thinks that that number will climb.
Now, Sean, in the world of economics, Commonwealth Bank reckons that Australia's budget deficit is running well ahead, i.e. it's lower, than forecast in October last year.
We'll hear lots more about the budget in coming months, something to look forward to, and we all know that as a result of the massive spending during the COVID pandemic, Australia is set to run budget deficits for many, many years. But CommBank's chief economist, Stephen Halmarick, a friend of our show here, reckons the underlying budget deficit for the second half of last year was running at under $15 billion, which is about $11.5 billion, better than Treasury forecast. Why do we care about this? Well, we have to pay the money back at some point. That's pretty obvious. But also, the less profligate fiscal policy is, the less work interest rates have to do to rein in the economy. If you think about that, if the government's spending more, then it's putting a stimulus into the economy, and interest rates are kind of being used to pull that back. If it's spending less, maybe interest rates don't have to do as much work.
I'm just still stuck on your use of the term profligate.
Yeah, I actually had to look it up to spell it. And I am ashamed, but it's one of those words I really struggle to say, profligate. So I'm really proud that I looked it up, got the spelling right, practiced before we came on this morning. Profligate.
Well done. And Sean, there are signs, albeit anecdotal, of wage pressures in the economy.
Yes, we're waiting to see this. Now, the latest fortnightly data from the Fair Work Commission released yesterday says average bargained wage increases rose to 4.1% in December, reflecting new agreements in the hospitality, education services and manufacturing sectors. The previous fortnight, the increase was 2.8%. So that's quite a jump. Now, this is very anecdotal, so we'll need to see a run of data before we say these wage pressures are coming through. But certainly over the past fortnight, we've seen them.
Sean, copper miner Oz Minerals is about to be taken over by BHP. Well, that's the plan, but yesterday it warned that the cost of producing copper in South Australia could rise by 10% on the back of soaring electricity prices.
The company's unit costs over the past 2 years have more than trebled. The disclosures come ahead of April's vote on the $9.6 billion takeover offer from BHP. Overall, Oz Minerals reported very strong production levels in the last 3 months of 2022. In fact, it achieved record output. But for the full year, output disappointed due to earlier weather and COVID disruptions.
Lynas Rare Earths also reported its quarterly production and investors were impressed.
Yes, its share price jumped 7% as a result of higher revenues in that production report. Its production overall last year had been hampered by water supply disruptions, but the last 3 months it made up some ground.
And finally, Sean, David Jones has dumped American Express as its partner for its DJ's card and will work with Latitude Financial.
Yeah, it's quite a win for Latitude to get into store cards, and its share price reflected that yesterday, jumping at 9% or so. The 10-year deal was called a strategic pillar by DJ's boss, Scott Fife. Latitude plans to acquire David Jones's existing cards portfolio. There are about 190,000 active DJ credit card users, and they'll be issued new cards from December. Now, just before Christmas, DJ's was bought by private equity group Anchorage Capital, and the new owners will take full control in March, and we'll get the rollout of new store cards.
All right, now moving on to overseas news, and we mentioned this story at the top of the show, Sean, and it is an absolute cracker. There has been a massive barney going on overseas involving Indian resource giant Adani, which has a big presence here in Australia, particularly Queensland. A New York-based research group, Hindenburg Research, last week made allegations of stock manipulation and accounting fraud.
They're pretty serious allegations to put against a major company. They triggered a sell-off in Adani's share price with about $50 billion in value being wiped off the stock. Now, founder Gautam Adani is Asia's richest person, and he has come out fighting. Mr. Adani and the company have said the report, which claimed manipulation and fraud over decades, was maliciously mischievous. Over the weekend, Adani released a rebuttal of the claims and claimed that the short sellers report was a calculated attack on India. But the sell-off continued, and the conglomerate has now lost about $66 billion in value. It is not that often that you get a major company being taken on by a short seller and its report being given so much credence. So that's why this makes it so interesting, is that people have read Hindenburg Research, which isn't actually a very big research house in the US relative to others, and believed it. So we'll see how this one plays out.
Okay, now, Sean, it may not be the biggest car company in the world anymore, but it sells the most vehicles. Toyota in 2022 topped the rankings, shifting 10.5 million vehicles.
Yes, Toyota came in ahead of Volkswagen. Now, sales from Toyota include subsidiaries Daihatsu and Hino Motors. Volkswagen sales fell 7% last year to 8.3 million units, which was its worst performance in 11 years. 2022, of course, was full of supply chain disruption and by the end of the year, weakening demand. But Toyota said it still isn't able to make enough cars to shorten delivery times. And in fact, there's waits of months and in some models, even years. So a way to go there, but Toyota continues to stay on top in terms of vehicles sold.
And finally, Sean, you mentioned this one briefly earlier. Iran has acknowledged a drone strike targeted one of its military sites in the central city of Isfahan at the weekend.
But the country stopped short of accusing any foreign or opposition groups of engineering the attack, according to the Financial Times. The Iranian Defense Ministry said a drone carrying a small bomb hit the roof of one building in a facility late on Saturday night, while two other drones were intercepted and destroyed. There were no casualties, it added, and no disruption was caused other than some minor damage, but it certainly triggered geopolitical concerns.
All right, now up next is the Fear and Greed Daily interview with Charlie Hales, Asia Pacific Managing Director at the UK-based tech company Waterstones.
Yes, all about cybercrime and getting your own company prepared for the almost inevitable attack that you're going to receive from cyber criminals at some point in the future.
Yeah, it's a very, very important conversation. It is coming up next in the Fear and Greed playlist on your podcast platform or at fearandgreed.com.au. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you, Michael.
It's Tuesday, the 31st of January, 2023. Make sure you're following the podcast and join us online on LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. I'm Michael Thompson, and that was Fear and Greed. Have a great day.